And the feature of the whole self-esteem movement that elicits particularly withering criticism is loosened conditionality, the possibility that children may be getting something for nothing, or at least for less effort. Something includes that which is tangible, trophies, symbolic, grades, and verbal, praise. Now, in the case of self-esteem, it extends to the psychological. The fact is that no research has ever shown that unconditionality has adverse consequences. It may offend the sensibilities of those with what Lakoff called a strict father morality, but to the best of my knowledge, not a single article or book has ever cited evidence showing it to be disadvantageous in terms of future achievement, psychological health, or anything else. In fact, the research reveals exactly the opposite to be true, particularly where self-esteem is concerned. To understand this, we need to take a step back. I've been arguing that self-esteem is a reasonably important variable, and that higher self-esteem is generally better than lower. But over the last few years, a number of psychologists have suggested that what matters most about self-esteem isn't how much of it one has. Just as there are different ways of thinking about motivation, for example, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic, instead of seeing it as a single entity that can go up or down, the same is true here. In particular, self-esteem varies in terms of stability. If it's unstable or fragile, even more than if it's predictably low, the result may be anger or depression. Conversely, even someone whose self-esteem is generally high may struggle with self-doubt and become defensive if that positive view isn't secure. As one group of researchers put it, quote, individuals with fragile high self-esteem are willing to go to great lengths to defend their positive yet vulnerable feelings of self-worth. They often overreact to perceived threats to their self-worth by becoming angry and either criticizing or attacking the source of the threat, unquote. Interestingly, one indication that someone has unstable self-esteem is, quote, a greater tendency to invoke one's feelings of self-worth in everyday activities, unquote. The more variation there is in how you feel about yourself from one situation to the next, the more likely you are to be preoccupied with the whole issue of self-esteem. People with a steady, even if not completely positive, view of their own competence or value don't have to spend time thinking about how good they are or deliberately trying to feel better about themselves. But what makes self-esteem unstable? All of us receive feedback that is sometimes positive and sometimes negative. All of us do some things we're proud of and some things we regret, yet the stability of one person's self-esteem may be quite different from someone else's. What accounts for that? The crucial determinant of stability, it seems, is unconditionality. It's a solid core of belief in yourself, an abiding sense that you're competent and worthwhile even when you screw up or fall short, that creates a more stable form of self-esteem, which in turn carries a range of psychological and social advantages. The flip side is that where self-esteem is concerned, fragility is really a symptom of conditionality. If you think well of yourself only under certain conditions, if you regard self-esteem as something that must always be earned and therefore is forever in doubt, then you're in for trouble, psychologically speaking. Low self-esteem, I don't feel very good about myself, is bad enough. Self-esteem that's contingent, I feel good about myself only when, is even more worrisome. Contingent on what, though? Some bases for feeling good about oneself may be worse than others. Jennifer Crocker, a psychologist at Ohio State University, and her colleagues have shown that the prognosis is particularly bad when self-esteem hinges on outdoing others, competitive success, approval by others, physical appearance, or academic achievement. Consider the last of those. when children's self-esteem rises or falls with how well they do at school, achievement can resemble an addiction, quote, requiring ever greater success to avoid feelings of worthlessness. And if it looks as though success is unlikely, kids may disengage from the task, deciding it doesn't matter, rather than suffer the loss of self-esteem that accompanies failure, unquote. That, you may remember, is what's known as self-handicapping. If I need to do well in order to feel good about myself, that may sometimes light a fire under me so I will avoid embarrassing myself. But if I face something really hard, I'll create an excuse for not having succeeded. Either way, my real goal isn't to learn. It's to rescue my shaky belief in my own competence. If I can do that by figuring out a reason why it makes sense that I fell short, then that's what I'll choose. The bottom line is that, quote, contingent self-worth is an ineffective source of motivation, unquote. People who don't think their value hinges on their performance, meanwhile, are more likely to see failure as just a temporary setback, a problem to be solved. The danger here isn't limited to achievement-based self-esteem, however. In fact, it may not matter what exactly one has to do or be in order to feel good about oneself. The problem is inherent to the idea of conditionality, which is, quote, associated with anxiety, hostility, defensiveness, and the risk of depression. And that's not all. Studies have found that contingent self-esteem is related to feelings of helplessness and also to maladaptive perfectionism. Teenagers whose acceptance of themselves depends on external factors suffer more intensely if they're bullied. College students with conditional self-esteem are more likely to drink, quote, as a means of gaining social approval or avoiding social rejection, unquote. Some psychologists have suggested that it can also contribute to narcissism and materialistic values. And when people with conditional self-esteem have children of their own, they may base how they feel about themselves on how successful those children are. That not only impairs their own emotional functioning, but also leads to a controlling style of parenting, which may start the cycle all over again in the next generation. Even before researchers began collecting all these data, many psychotherapists had figured it out. Alice Miller wrote that one is free from depression, quote, only when self-esteem is based on the authenticity of one's own feelings and not on the possession of certain qualities, unquote. Carl Rogers traced any number of problems to our having been taught to place conditions of worth on ourselves. Psychotherapists attempt to supply that unconditional positive regard that we may have been missing. Experimental evidence seems to confirm that people who have that unconditional faith in themselves are less likely to be anxious or depressed. This is powerful stuff. The very unconditionality that is ridiculed by conservatives, indeed that seems to account for their penchant for vilifying the whole self-esteem movement, turns out to be a defining feature of psychological health. It's precisely what we should be helping our children to acquire. That doesn't mean harboring unrealistic or grandiose beliefs about one's own competence. Quite the contrary. It means being sufficiently secure about oneself so as to be able to acknowledge one's failings and try to improve. Neither does unconditional or stable self-esteem imply that our feelings about ourselves never vary. It's natural to be happier, in general and with oneself, when we're successful, and to be disappointed when we aren't. But underlying those temporary fluctuations is a permanent reservoir of respect for oneself, a fundamental acceptance of one's own worth. In one of my favorite movies, Harold and Maude, the almost 80-year-old Maude admits that even though she's impatient with people who are too attached to their possessions, she too enjoys collecting things. But she immediately qualifies this by describing those things as, quote, incidental, not integral, if you know what I mean. That's an apt way of thinking about our successes and failures with respect to self-esteem. Their impact isn't integral to how we see ourselves. How does self-esteem become conditional? So, what determines whether people place conditions on the way they regard themselves? There are no hard and fast answers here. No one has ever conducted a study that can settle the matter once and for all. In fact, there may not be a single answer for everyone. But the best guess is that conditional self-esteem results from having been esteemed conditionally by others. When children feel as though they must fulfill certain conditions to be loved by their parents, a feeling typically evoked by the use of psychological control, it's not easy for them to accept themselves unconditionally, and everything goes downhill from there. Susan Harder, a developmental psychologist at the University of Denver, points out that, quote, level of support and conditionality of support are correlated with one another, unquote. In other words, the kind of parents who are not especially warm and loving also tend to be the kind who put conditions on the affection they do provide. But even when you hold the level of support constant, the degree of conditionality counts. Quote, at relatively high as well as relatively low levels of support, she explains, the more conditional the support, the lower one's self-esteem. And the more likely it is that one's self-esteem will also be conditional. That's not really surprising, is it? Children don't just need to be loved. They need to know that nothing they do will change the fact that they're loved. They require reassurance that their lovability isn't in question, which is another way of talking about self-esteem. By contrast, one conservative critic of self-esteem not only complains about unearned praise for children, but expresses distaste for how today's parents are likely to express, quote, enthusiasm for their children's very existence, unquote. Would that it were true. The eminent psychoanalyst and social critic Erich Fromm put it this way, quote, unconditional love corresponds to one of the deepest longings, not only of the child, but of every human being. On the other hand, to be loved because of one's merit, because one deserves it, always leaves doubt. Maybe I did not please the person I wanted to love me. Maybe this or that. There's always a fear that love could disappear. Furthermore, deserved love easily leaves a bitter feeling that one is not loved for oneself, that one is loved only because one pleases, that one is, in the last analysis, not loved at all, but used, unquote. Beginning in 2004, two Israeli researchers, Avi Asor and Guy Roth, and their colleagues, have been conducting experiments to examine this issue scientifically. They started by asking college students whether the love they had received from their parents seemed to depend on whether they had succeeded in school, practiced hard for sports, been considerate toward others, or suppressed emotions such as anger and fear. The answer? Yes, that was indeed true for many of them. Their parents probably would have been dismayed to hear they felt that way. But what determines a psychological outcome isn't what parents think they're doing. It's how the children experience it. It turned out that kids who received what they interpreted as conditional approval were indeed somewhat more likely to act the way the parent wanted. But that compliance came at a steep price. First, these children tended to resent and dislike their parents. Second, they were more likely to attribute their behavior to strong internal pressure than to a real sense of choice. Moreover, their satisfaction after succeeding at something was usually short-lived, and they often felt guilty or ashamed. The researchers then interviewed a group of mothers of grown children. With this generation, too, conditional parenting had proved damaging. Those mothers who, when they were young, sensed they were loved only when they lived up to their parents' expectations, now felt less worthy as adults. Yet despite the negative effects, these mothers were more likely to use conditional affection with their own children. Apart from being profoundly depressing, that finding can serve as a metaphorical Rorschach test, revealing something about one's way of thinking about such issues. Is it mysterious and counterintuitive? Why on earth would someone do to her children exactly what damaged her? Or is it perfectly predictable? How could someone love her children unconditionally if she never received that kind of love herself? Asor, Roth, and their collaborators have gone on to publish a variety of replications and extensions of these original studies. In one of them, their subjects were ninth graders, and this time giving more attention and affection when children did what parents wanted was carefully distinguished from giving less when they didn't. The study showed that both positive and negative versions of conditional parenting were harmful, but in slightly different ways. The positive kind, praise for success, sometimes succeeded in getting children to work harder on academic tasks, but again at the cost of unhealthy feelings of, quote, internal compulsion. Negative conditional parenting, meanwhile, didn't even work in the short run. It just increased the teenagers' resentment toward their parents. In their other studies, which were conducted with children from age 5 to 23, conditional parenting had consistently disturbing effects on their emotional and social well-being. If young children got the idea that their parents valued them more when they were happy, that interfered with their ability to recognize and respond to sadness in other people. If young adults had perceived that their parents' affection varied with the extent to which they were helpful and considerate, that affected the way these grown children thought about helping. It seemed less a matter of choice than something they felt they had to do to try to feel better about themselves. If teenagers got the idea that their parents' approval of them depended on how well they did in school, they were apt to be self-aggrandizing when they succeeded and ashamed when they failed. Quote, conditional positive regard promoted the development of a fragile, contingent, and unstable sense of self. Unquote. Regardless of the child's age, regardless of what behavior is required as a condition of the parent's love, and regardless of whether love is offered for engaging in that behavior or withheld for not engaging in it, the outcomes are troubling. In fact, they're troubling even when a teacher rather than a parent seems to accept children only conditionally. One way of making sense of these findings, I've argued, is to consider the creation of conditional self-acceptance. The adult's "my care for you depends on your doing X" becomes the child's "I'm worthwhile only if I do X." Research confirms that conditionality is a recipe for dysfunction. But our objections may go beyond what the data say. In a scholarly article entitled Contingencies of Self-Worth, Jennifer Crocker and Connie Wolf took 24 pages to review empirical findings on the topic. And then at the very end, they took the unusual step of adding a personal note. Quote, "We are alarmed at the suggestion that schools should be teaching or creating self-esteem that is justified by achievements or warranted." Baumeister, 1999, Seligman, 1998. Such recommendations are equally lacking in empirical support. Furthermore, and perhaps more seriously, the logical implication of this approach is that some children's low self-esteem is warranted, and that children who do not achieve in socially desirable ways, such as getting good grades, being attractive and popular, or being good at sports, rightly believe that they are not worthy human beings. It is a slippery slope from the view that self-esteem can be warranted or unwarranted to the view that some people are unworthy and justifiably devalued. Unquote. The attack on empty or excessive praise, or on unearned grades or trophies, is not just about what adults offer to kids. It's ultimately about how kids view themselves. There is no evidence to support the idea that self-esteem is inflated or that children do better when their view of themselves varies with their performance or with anything else. But once again, this critique is based less on evidence than on the value judgment that feeling good about oneself is something one ought to have to earn. Crocker and Wolf confronted that value judgment head on, saying, in effect, that this is an appalling way to raise and educate children. How well you do things should be incidental, not integral, to the way you regard yourself.